Hello, hello, hello. My name's Dave. This is the Book on Fire podcast. I'm alone today. I'm sitting at my usual spot here on the couch, but Janet is not with me. I'm here to record a short solo episode. We are still making our way through the dawn of everything, slowly making our way through the dawn of everything. We're having a long season of the Book on Fire this time, to cover a long book with a lot of different ideas in it and try and do it at the same time as we're navigating everything else in our lives. And we're currently preparing our discussion of chapter 7 of the book, which is called The Ecology of Freedom. But we've had some curveballs coming our way in life, including a family member in the hospital that are slowing us down. And so in the meantime, I thought that maybe while y'all are awaiting our discussion about chapter 7, I would record this episode that is like a short book report, maybe, on this book by James C. Scott called Against the Grain, which focuses on the same area in time and place in the so-called Neolithic in the Fertile Crescent as these chapters of the Dawn of Everything are focused on. And it gives us another perspective, and potentially some more clarity on the historical processes that the Davids are describing there. It's a pretty great book. It's also a book that the Davids clearly approve of. They cite this book in The Dawn of Everything. And James C. Scott is definitely a colleague and I believe a friend of theirs too. So just to set the stage here, right, in chapter 6 and chapter 7, one of the main things that's happening is in the Dawn of Everything is that they're deconstructing this idea. They're refuting this idea that cultivation and agriculture necessarily leads to the state, to the hierarchical state in some kind of like linear deterministic way, right? Because there's this pretty popular and widespread idea, even if it's not really popular in academia anymore, that humans didn't know how to cultivate things, how to plant seeds, and then at some point they learned how. And that this learning how to cultivate and learning how to plant was this watershed where people were just strongly, driven to this activity in order to maximize their survival, have a surplus, that people were basically almost captured by this knowledge of how to grow plants. Like it was so strongly advantageous and so strongly attractive that they dropped everything to really focus on this. And to focus on this meant to settle down and give up nomadism. And so settled communities and towns, originated because of this. And settling down, devoting your lives to agriculture, gave rise to these hierarchies for various reasons, because of the surplus that was generated by agriculture and because of the labor needs and the organization of labor. And then we very quickly get the state as a result of all of this. And it turns out that there's a lot of problems with this whole story. For one thing, you could even begin by asking, what even is agriculture, right? Because this is the agricultural thesis of the state. And the Davids help us understand how cultivation does not equal domestication, right? Cultivating plants. I'm even leaving animals out of this story, but cultivation does not equal domestication. And even once we have domesticated plants, that can be done in all kinds of ways that do not add up to agriculture in the sense of, plowed, fixed fields, irrigated agriculture, all of these things that would come to be associated with the state. Later, people were doing cultivation, all kinds of working with the environment in these very, very complex ways, without developing the kind of farming that would be associated with the state later. And even once you have villages that are growing grains as staple crops, which, becomes more common at a certain point in the Fertile Crescent, these in no way necessarily generate states and hierarchy just by growing grains. So for all these and for other reasons, that very simplified idea about agriculture creating states is basically in tatters. So after all of this, we are left to wonder that if there's not a linear, deterministic relationship between cultivation, domestication, agriculture, the state, then what is the relationship between these things? Right? What is the relationship? You might come away from the dawn of everything thinking that there's just no relationship. There's no relationship between these things. But that's also unsatisfying. We know that there's a historical relationship, at least. But the Davids aren't really interested in exploring the relationship between farming, grains, hierarchy, the state, either in theory, like the theoretical relationship, or the historical relationship, really. So as fascinating and as instructive as this part of the book is, there is this emptiness that it leaves right in the center of these stories that they're trying to tell and these questions that they're trying to answer. However, there comes a point towards the end of the book where all of this sort of comes up again. And at that point, the Davids reluctantly, somewhat reluctantly, seemingly concede that the relationship between agriculture and the earliest states is one of precondition. That agriculture is a necessary precondition for the earliest states, right? Agriculture does not deterministically lead to a state, but a state cannot exist without the agricultural foundation. And when they make this concession at the end of the book, they are bowing to the conclusion of a colleague of theirs who they have a lot of respect for and whose book they clearly read. And that is the book I'm here to talk about today. The book is called Against the Grain by James C. Scott. Now, James C. Scott, he's a professor of political science, and he has written a lot of books that I think would be of interest to folks who are listening to this podcast or who are reading The Dawn of Everything and are interested in what we're talking about here. He's very interested in states and statecraft. And though I wouldn't call Scott an anarchist necessarily, he definitely he's not a fan. He is not a fan of states. And in fact, one of his really greatest books is called The Art of Not Being Governed. The Art of Not Being Governed. And that's a book that describes with a lot of ethnographic detail the way that various peoples in Southeast Asia have evaded and still do evade being, controlled and coerced and basically incorporated into the states that are also present in Southeast Asia, right? So what does it take? What is the art of living with states in your vicinity, but not being forcibly controlled, coerced, and governed by those states? But this book, Against the Grain, it's called Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States. And we can guess from the title there, Against the Grain, and on the cover of the book, there's a shaft of barley, that grain is going to be a part of this story. I read this book when it came out I read it in the summer of 2018. I think it's copyright 2017. So a fairly recent book. It's not long. I think it only has 7 chapters and it's just a couple hundred pages. And it's written for a popular audience. So, I really recommend the book. It does not take long to read. It is an accessible distillation of the current academic theory and knowledge that he has access to. So to me, it seems to be pretty up to date and formed in large part, as he says in the introduction, out of not just reading, but conversations that he had with the relevant experts in their field, including David Graeber and David Wengrow, trying to create this ecologically focused story about the rise of the earliest states. So the book is definitely focused on Mesopotamia. In fact, for this book, we have to shift our focus just a little bit over from what we've dealt with in The Dawn of Everything so far, because in chapter 6, The Gardens of Adonis, when they talk about the Neolithic settlements in the Fertile Crescent and the flood retreat cultivation and people working with clay and straw and thatch and the skull portraits and all of that anthropology that's presented in chapter 6, they are focused on the part of the Fertile Crescent that is sometimes called the Levant. So like the Jordan River Valley, the town of Jericho, the part of the Fertile Crescent that's closest to the Mediterranean. And for Against the Grain, the focus is Mesopotamia, so the area between and including the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys closer to the Persian Gulf in what's now Iraq, where the earliest states, and as Scott calls them, statelets, like Ur and Uruk, emerged. So same region, still the Fertile Crescent, but we're going to Mesopotamia, primarily for Against the Grain. So yeah, one thing that's important to know about this book is that it is mainly a historical text, which means that it's more concerned with telling an accurate story of how things happened in a particular time and place than it is with developing a general theory, right? A general theory of what agriculture means or how states form, right? It's here to tell a specific story. And of course, these histories inform our theories, but it's more about the history. Although there is a bit of theorization that does come up in here. And he does make analogies to some other places where states formed, like the Yellow River Valley, the Indus Valley, the Nile, and to a much lesser extent, the Inca and Maya civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. And one of the main reasons why I want to talk about this book is because it helps us fill a couple of gaping holes in the story that's told in The Dawn of Everything, like big holes. And just some strange blind spots in The Dawn of Everything. And that is going to come closer to the end. So let's see if I can quickly just recapitulate what I think are the main points of Scott's book that are relevant to what we're talking about here, because he does have some pretty fascinating history and musings about barbarians and that are outside the influence of states eventually once states become dominant, and like the golden age of the barbarians and all this stuff. But I'm not going to cover that here. I'm just going to talk about the thread of the narrative that is most relevant to these chapters of The Dawn of Everything. And Scott begins his story with fire. He begins it right at the beginning with fire. And I'll say from the outset that one of the virtues of this book, Against the Grain, is that Scott is very familiar, very up to date with the concept of humans being ecosystem modifiers, landscape modifiers. I learned recently that in academia, this is called niche construction theory. And it's called that to highlight the idea that humans, and I mean really a lot of different species, but humans among them, don't just have an ecological niche that they must find and fit themselves into, but that humans can create their ecological niche by acting on the world. And this is important, right? Because the cartoon idea of hunter-gatherers is that the world is just given to them as it is, and that hunter-gatherers, walk around basically subsisting off of whatever they encounter in the landscape. Like, oh, look, there's a deer. Let's kill it and we can eat that. Or, oh, look, a berry patch. We can eat these berries, And that humans are basically just passive consumers of whatever is just offered up by the environment. Until farming. And then farming changes all of that, right? But that story is false. That story is woefully out of date. That story in the academic world is being replaced by things like niche construction theory, which emphasizes the ability and the propensity of humans to be using tools like fire to modify the landscape to help create their own niche, right? To be able to work with, in a co-creative type of relationship, to work with the environment in such a way as to make it more abundant for human habitation. So Scott starts off the book by talking about fire and how fire was like the earliest tool. Fire being used to cook food is arguably one of the things really responsible for our increase in brain size and all this other stuff, but then also fire as a landscape management tool, landscape modification tool. So he covers that as just the baseline. And fire as a tool predates Homo sapiens, right? Goes way back, hundreds of thousands of years. But then fast forwarding quite a bit closer to the time period under consideration here, we come to the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene, right? The Holocene being the warmer, wetter, more fertile, more just biologically abundant time period that humans enter into after the end of the Ice Age and the thinning of the glacial sheets and all of that. And humans have a lot more possibilities for life once we go into the Holocene. For one thing, sedentary lifeways become a lot more possible, including potentially full-time year-round sedentary lifeways. And this is, far predating agricultural towns and villages, but sedentary lifeways. And why do they become more possible entering into the Holocene? Well, it's because during the Ice Age, in short, there was less biological abundance. But what you did have was a lot of big game. And so hunting big game is usually associated with being nomadic or semi-nomadic, right? Because the big game migrate to wherever the food for them is good. And then humans have to either move to intercept their migration or they follow the game, right? And so when big game is going to be the center of your way of life, then it's hard to live a sedentary lifestyle. But then entering into the Holocene, especially in these very wet environments, like wetland environments, like the Davids we're discussing in chapter 6, you have just explosions of fecundity and fertility in these river valleys and where the rivers let out their water into the sea, where there's these big fan-like deltas, these river deltas with all these channels, and they are just teeming with life, with shellfish, with fish, with birds of all kinds, with mammals that can also be eaten. And so going into the Holocene, we see it be increasingly common for people to inhabit these fertile river valleys, especially wetlands, and especially deltaic, alluvial wetland areas where there's a great diversity of food sources that can be relied on that are not necessarily migratory big game. It's not that the migratory big game are abandoned entirely, even though some of the biggest game would start becoming extinct, going into the Holocene, because they were less adapted to those type of climatic conditions. But there's just a great diversity of food resources that are lower on the trophic scale. They are very numerous. They are smaller, right? Like there's less biomass per creature, but they're so numerous and they're so diverse that you can have a really abundant, really nice way of life if you post up kind of on the borders between some of these very abundant riverine type of ecosystems where you can go seasonally forth in one direction or another and find what you need. So in the Holocene, in the Fertile Crescent, and elsewhere, we start to see these sedentary or semi-sedentary communities formed of people who are really thriving off of these wetland and alluvial webs of life. And this is important to talk about because it's basically in these contexts that agriculture is going to arise. And even that, Scott points out, is somewhat of a revolutionary idea because apparently it was for a long time assumed that agriculture began in somewhat arid places next to the river where irrigation was necessary in order to grow the crops. I guess what happened there with that theory is that the people were forming that theory based on the remains of these like much later like walled towns that had irrigated fields adjacent to them that were in the regions of these great rivers. And what Scott is pointing out here is that those places are like much further down the timeline than the sites of the beginnings of permanent settlements and of the beginnings of agriculture and cultivation. It's actually very abundant wetland environments where you first see these things happening. And that also kind of tears to shreds this other theory, which is that agriculture could only develop where people had no other means of subsistence. That's, I think he calls it the backs to the wall theory of agriculture, where people would only be forced into cultivation if they were forced for demographic or climate reasons into a very like resource poor, like resource deprived area where they're like, well, I guess let's just do this seed planting cultivation thing because we don't have access to other resources. That's not the case. The earliest cultivation was not in these poor environments at all, but was in very rich environments. And what we see is that the earliest cultivation, including the earliest grain cultivation, comes about as just another tool in this like super diverse strategy of niche construction that people are employing in these fertile type of wetlands type of areas, right? In chapter 6, we talked about flood recession agriculture. So this is like where the periodic flooding of a river like the Tigris or the Euphrates would scour certain amount of the banks of the river. And then when the waters receded, you would get this very nice silty plain that you could just throw seeds out onto, and they would grow without any kind of plowing or harrowing or added fertility or anything like that. So people were doing this. People were growing little stands of this or that plant in environments that provided an opportunity to do that. And they were harvesting shellfish, they were hunting small game, they were going out for bigger game hunts, they were utilizing all kinds of wild plant resources and everything too. And the earliest cultivation was just in this context of people who already had a lot, but they were just obsessively engaged with their environment and trying out all kinds of things, and scattering seeds was just one of the things that they had in their toolkit of activities that they found to be worthwhile. And as far as the political implications, Scott is convinced that in these downriver, river delta, mixed wetland, very diverse, abundant landscapes, that inhabiting these landscapes, even sedentary year-round habitation of these ecosystems, is not a fertile ground for hierarchy in the state. And in fact, they lend themselves very well to decentralization for a few reasons. For one thing, the settlements can only be so big because the settlements have to exist on these permanently dry islands. He calls them turtlebacks, that exist within a wetland ecology, right? So it's a lot of wetland, a lot of marsh, and then with the periodic flooding of the river, that disturbs a lot of the landscape. So there's a relatively small amount of land that's permanently above the waterline and permanently dry and not a marsh. And these are relatively small compared to this vast river delta type of landscape. And so the settlements are on these kind of spaced out turtlebacks, these islands in the delta. So the population sizes are limited. And then also just, it's very, very, very hard for anybody to monopolize the resources that are needed for life, because it's so abundant and there's so many different resources and so many different ways of acquiring them and everything. And so Scott insists that this is not where the state forms. And in history, we see that this is not where the state forms. Not there. But where it happens is a little bit upriver. Not so far upriver that it's in the hills, because hill country is not good for state formation either, but there's a middle zone. There's a middle zone. We see this in the Nile. We see this in the Indus. We see this in the Tigris, Euphrates. There's a middle zone where It's still the river valley. It's still a nice, abundant, attractive ecosystem for people to live in. And there's still periodic flooding of the rivers that allows for flood retreat, cultivation of grains. And people are living in this area of the river too, quite happily and relatively non-hierarchically for a couple thousand years. And it's actually here that we see the earliest states pop up in Mesopotamia. And why, though? Why do we see them show up here? What's the story there? And he cites a theory, and he's clear that there's no decisive proof of this theory as to why this was the location of the earliest states, but there is a theory out there that he pulls from an author named Nissen. His last name is Nissen. Hans J. Nissen, The Early History of the Ancient Near East. And the theory involves a climate change event that happened, right at about the right time for it to explain what's going to happen next. One of the impacts of which was that there was less water in these rivers all of a sudden. And less water in the rivers meant that the periodic flooding of the rivers was like the rivers did not flood as much. And so they did not deposit as much silt as they did and did not create as much terrain for flood retreat. And then just like the less water in the environment just meant that there was less abundance of all the resources, not just the good flood retreat ground to be growing your crops in, but also, fewer wild plants, fewer wild animals that feed off the wild plants, fewer, shellfish beds and all of this stuff too. So what happened as a result of this was that the people who were living in these more upriver environments, the people down in the deltas were still fine because there's still enough water that ended up and fanned out down there at the deltas that they were able to still just have like a very diverse subsistence and very scattered on the turtlebacks and all of this stuff. But a little bit upriver, it affected them more strongly. And what happened was their ecosystems that they were engaged with, that they were subsisting off of, were already a little bit less diverse than down in the delta. And then they became less diverse again because of being less well supplied with water. And because the course of the river shrank to a narrower channel and the floods were less extensive, people who were living there had to congregate and move themselves closer to the river. So they became more tightly packed. The settlements became more tightly packed. And not only that, but in order to sustain their population, they had to intensify their cultivation of grain a little bit more so. And so what that took the form of was more irrigation of the fields, more permanent fields, after which in these upriver environments, you found more concentrated populous towns and settlements that were relying more heavily on grain and investing more labor in the production of that grain. Labor in the form of things like irrigation. And Scott's argument then is that it is in this precondition that the state is able to form. That the state comes and appropriates this particular type of demographic happenstance. Tightly packed people investing a lot of labor into agriculture and already doing irrigation for climate/demographic reasons, and very different from the other folks who are cultivating grains and other things all around them in the same region. These people are living in a different way, and it's in this place, and because of these demographic features that are ripe for exploitation by something like the state and hierarchical power, that's where we find the states. That's where we find the earliest states. So this is all very interesting, and this is all very important. This is James C. Scott's story as the best that he can do to assemble a story, reaching from all of these diverse academic resources and having all these different conversations with his colleagues to explain why these states show up where they do, in the way they do, at the time that they do, and what longer story of humans in these regions of the world is state formation a part of. Now, in this book, at least, Scott is he does not approach the concept of the state with a lot of like analytical detail. What you don't get from Scott is a story of like, what are the internal dynamics of these towns on the banks of these rivers doing agriculture? What are the internal political dynamics, that arise from this condition that turns into hierarchy of labor, eventually bureaucracy and writing and things like the state? He doesn't get into that. That's not what this book is about. And so you don't get that story. He kind of talks about the state as if it's as if it's like something that comes from the outside, and I mean, it's kind of easy for us these days to think about the state as like something non-human that's basically parasitic on human life. And that's kind of the way he projects it back into the past, almost like the state is like a disembodied demonic entity that's like flying over the land and looking down on all these places where humans are doing all of this novel activity and looking for like a good host where it could like swoop down and possess a community, and turn it into the state form. That's kind of the idea that you get from reading Scott. It's actually, The Dawn of Everything is a book that is going to have something to offer about the internal dynamics of these communities, these cultures, where the freedom breaks down and becomes the state. In the later chapters of The Dawn of Everything, we get their theories about how that process happens. But Against the Grain is not about that. It's just about the conditions in which the state arises, and not about like the blow by blow of how it actually comes about once those conditions are met. And lest I forget to include this part, I don't know if it's a novel contribution, but it's one of the most widely cited and remembered parts of Against the Grain is James Scott's theory of grain agriculture, specifically grains, being a precondition for the state. And this seems to be more or less historically true, like state formation only happens on the back of grain agriculture. And Scott is arguing that it's perhaps necessarily true. At one point in the book, he asks, like, why do we not see any sweet potato states or yam states or banana states or cassava states? Or even chickpea states or lentil states? Chickpeas and lentils being some very early domesticated crops in Mesopotamia. But however, Scott is, his unique theory here is that it's only grains that are compatible with the taxation that is associated with statecraft. So statecraft, like one of the fundamental properties of statecraft is taxation. Because taxation is what enables the bureaucrats that are in charge of the state to be able to just live off of the labor of everybody else, the material labor of all the farmers and everybody else. And to make a longer and very interesting part of the book very much shorter, he basically argues that it's only grains that can be efficiently and easily taxed of all of the food crops. And that's because grains, they have a bunch of features. One of them is that they all ripen at the same time on the crop. Not all the different grain, not that barley ripens at the same time as wheat or whatever, but if you're all growing barley in a field, that whole field is going to come ripe at the same time. And so that is different than beans. That's different than legumes. That's different than bananas. They come ripe at the same time and they ripen above ground. And so that means that the tax collector just has to know what time to show up, and it's harvest time, and the tax collector can leave with a percentage of your harvest. And that's going to be a lot harder to do if you're growing potatoes, where they can be left underground for as long as you want. You can just dig them up whenever you need them, and there's not a harvest time where the whole crop has to be collected, threshed, and stored. But with grains, there's a time when the whole crop has to be collected, threshed, and stored. And then so the tax collector just conveniently comes by right then and is like, oh, nice pile of grain you got there. I'll be taking 20%. And in fact, one thing that happens in agricultural states is that the state starts to mandate the calendar of when you plant it, right? They say this district plants on this day, this district is going to plant on this day, this district is going to plant on this day, and that's timed that way so that the tax collectors can go around and collect your grain at the time, of the ripening based on when all the grains were planted. And then also grains are storable for a very long time, for years, in a way that bananas, sweet potatoes are not. And grains are also, they're very nutrient dense, and they're very kind of homogeneous in a way that, a grain is by definition like a small thing. And so you can kind of just weigh them out instead of counting them. They're very easy to partition. It's very easy to say 10% of the grains, and to take that much, right? So grains have all these features that make them compatible with taxation in a way that almost no other cultivated crop has these features. And so for all these reasons, Scott very strongly believes that it is in fact grains, and only grains, that make the state as we know it possible. And that is why his book is called Against the Grain. And finally now, there's one more really important piece to this story. And this is the part that I think gives us an important answer that we don't get from the dawn of everything, an important answer to a historical question. Once you have the hierarchical state in place, once you have the hierarchical grain-based state in place, then as long as that state is successful, it is going to be increasing in population. In fact, Scott makes the case that it is only to the extent that states can retain and increase their population that they are successful as states at all. And he quotes a bunch of there's like proverbs from the Bible, sayings about statecraft and governance from all around the world in a lot of different written traditions that basically talk about how population growth is necessary for the success of a state and for the continued power of its rulers. And Scott actually has a bunch of material in here about the lengths to which states went to keep people from fleeing, right? Because it wasn't always a happy place to be in these earliest of states. And so they would build walls, and the walls were partially to keep their people in, and not just to keep things out, but to keep their people in. And that they were frequently supplementing their population with war captives. They would go on raids just to bring people back, to bulk up their population and enslave them and create more laborers. And also, living in one of these hierarchical grain states, both politically encouraged and also just materially made possible great increases in reproduction. For instance, he has it in here from, I believe it was Richard Lee, maybe, that nomadic hunter-gatherers, on average, mothers have maybe one child every 4 years. And that has to do with the logistics of like carrying young'uns around when you live a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle, but also breastfeeding and the number of years spent before weaning of the child and things like this. And in a settled agricultural population, there's not only a strong demand and an urgent need for more and more labor, and sometimes the state would really get involved in this and actually have policies towards boosting reproduction stuff when we can even think about today and how we still are living in downstream of that very thing. But also there's just some, what do we call it, biological, like material affordances that come into play when people are living these more domesticated lives. For instance, you don't always be having to carry the babies around for long distances. And so that means that you could have like 2 or even 3 kids at one time that can't walk long distances. And that's more okay. That's like more doable, right? And also, if you have domesticated animals from which you're gathering their milk, then the milk can be a substitute for human milk. And so that means that a kid can be transferred onto goat milk, let's say, and can later even be like weaned onto soft foods like porridges that come from the grain. And all of these things enable the people to just be like cranking out the babies a lot faster than the foragers who might live nearby. So these states become like population explosion machines, expansive, greedy for people, population explosion machines. The increases in overall fertility that are associated with this kind of life are just immense. It's really staggering. And that's not even to account for the people who are captured in raids. One of the things that Scott talks about at some length in this book is how people crowded into these early cities, especially with domesticated livestock, they also had higher mortality because there was a lot of diseases that were being transferred from the domesticated animals, to just name one reason. But even in the face of this increased mortality, the fertility increase was really pronounced overall. And also, states like these are generally warlike. They want to conquer others and bring them under their dominion, and they want to capture people to enslave or to otherwise turn into laborers in the service of the state. And so I'm focusing on all of this because it tells a very important story about why states have come to dominate the globe. And this is a story that, for some reason, the Dawn of Everything really just can't get its mind around. The Dawn of Everything is really narrowly focused on disproving the proposition that if your people begin planting seeds and cultivating crops, then you will therefore become hierarchical and turn into a state. You know, if you revisit the Dawn of Everything and you read these chapters, this is always the frame. It's this like isolationist petri dish idea about people and cultures. And sure, I mean, you know, it's an important thing to think about in terms of a group of people who are making decisions together. What are going to be the implications, potentially, of shifting our way of life more towards cultivation? What's that going to mean for our power dynamics, right? Yes, very interesting, very important question. However, when we're talking about the history of humanity, which is what it says on the cover of the Dawn of Everything, right? A new history of humanity. When our scope is the human story and what did or did not happen in the human story, we need to not just talk about these cultures as being in isolation, you know? The Davids, I mean, they talk about cultures interacting in the context of schismogenesis, but in this context, they're satisfied to just show that if my people start cultivating crops, then there's all these possible ways that that activity does not have to lead directly into top-down hierarchies, property relations, state-like formations, that there's all these different possibilities that are open to us, even if we're going to plant crops. And after having done that, they sort of like dust off their hands and they're just like, great, our work is done here. But we don't live in isolation. People don't live in isolation. There's not just one we that we need to account for. There is always others. And even if we can cultivate crops without descending into hierarchy and property relations, it's still very possible that somewhere nearby, where the conditions are maybe different or just the history of the people there is somewhat different, that things are taking a different turn and that hierarchy has developed or even state formation. And even if we're living a peaceful, egalitarian life with a diverse subsistence strategy of cultivation and all these other things, if 100 miles away there's a state that's forming, then there's a good chance that that's going to affect our lives too. So this is a really different way to tell the story that the Davids are trying to tell. is that, you don't need to show that sedentism and cultivation and agriculture necessarily lead to hierarchy and state formation. You just need to show that those things make it possible. And then once it's possible, then it's hard to be surprised when these things do start to show up. And then when they show up, their drive to continual expansion, population increase, raids to capture and enslave their neighbors, and the spreading of this like meme of possibility all around, to be adopted either defensively or offensively, can account for why we all seem to be stuck in this very unfree world that is dominated by states, where it's not so much that we went through internal transformations culturally that had effects on how power is handled and shared, where egalitarianism broke down and led to these stuck hierarchical forms, including the state. Yeah, that happened for some of us, but for the majority of us, it's not even like we got stuck. It's more like we got incorporated by conquest and displacement into these expanding states that over time would be perfecting themselves and getting stronger and more able to expand their influence to every corner of the globe. So anyway, that is one of the things that I got out of reading Against the Grain, and I do think it points to a weakness in the Dawn of Everything's narrative, and maybe there's some nuance there that I am missing. I know that I'm definitely prone to my own blind spots sometimes, so if you have anything that you want to add to this conversation, or if you want to challenge me about something, or just help me elaborate on this in other ways, or if you have read Against the Grain and you just want to talk about it further, come on to the Discord. The link is in the show notes, and we can keep the discussion going. But, so that's it for this time. That is my book report on James C. Scott's Against the Grain. I think it's totally worth reading. Even though it's a pretty short book, there's a lot in here that I didn't talk about. So check it out. And with any luck, we'll be back at you pretty soon next time for our discussion about Chapter 7, The Ecology of Freedom. I love that. I love the title. Bye-bye.